In the 1920s, roughly 300,000 black Americans lived in a strip of Chicago's South Side that stretched about 30 blocks long and never more than 7 blocks wide. That arithmetic, that many people pressed into that little ground, explains almost everything that follows. The cultural explosion, the real estate fortunes, the jazz, the gambling, the violence, the towers, and the vacant lots. All of it starts with the math of too many people on too little land, and the question of who drew the lines that kept them there. But the South Side wasn't always defined by those lines. Before the people came north, before the color line hardened into concrete and expressway, the South Side belonged to a different economy entirely. One measured not in people per block, but in animals per hour. On Christmas Day, 1865, a consortium of 9 railroad companies opened the Union Stockyards on 320 acres of swampland just south of 39th Street. The land had been purchased from John Wentworth, a former Chicago mayor everyone called Long John, and within 5 years the place was processing 2 million animals a year. By 1890, the number was 9 million. By the early 1900s, the yards employed 25,000 people and handled 82% of the meat consumed in the entire country. Not a plurality, not a majority. 82%. Chicago didn't participate in the American meat industry. Chicago was the American meat industry. The money was staggering. Philip Danforth Armour built the first modern large-scale meatpacking plant at 45th and Elizabeth in 1867. And within a generation, his company and Gustavus Swift's had become among the first truly global American corporations. The disassembly line, their innovation, the reverse of what Henry Ford would later do with automobiles, turned a steer into packaged cuts in minutes. Refrigerated rail cars carried the product east. The capital flowed west. And around the yards, neighborhoods filled with the people who did the work. Germans, Irish, Poles, Lithuanians, Czechs, arriving in waves, living in the shadow of smokestacks and the permanent smell of rendered fat. The neighborhood just west of the packing houses didn't even bother with a pretty name. They called it Back of the Yards. State Street ran north-south through the middle of all this. South of the Loop, it passed through blocks of rooming houses and saloons, then through the edge of the Yards orbit, then further south into open prairie that speculators were already platting into lots. Remember State Street. It will carry every phase of this story on its back. The stockyard shaped Chicago's identity for half a century. Carl Sandburg called the city Hog Butcher for the World, and nobody argued. Upton Sinclair set his 1906 novel in the yard's killing floors and boarding houses, and the public outrage was so fierce it helped push through the Pure Food and Drug Act. Tourists came by the thousands to watch the spectacle of industrialized slaughter. The South Side Elevated Railroad opened a Stockyards branch in 1908, and on its first day, 25,000 people rode the line, most of them sightseers. The yards even had their own hotel, the Transit House, and their own Main Street, Exchange Avenue, where livestock brokers, commission men, and cattlemen from Montana conducted business that set beef prices for the nation. But the stockyard story, dramatic as it is prologue. The real story of the South Side begins with a newspaper and a railroad. In 1905, a Georgia-born lawyer named Robert Sengstack Abbott sat in the kitchen of his landlady's apartment on South State Street and printed 300 copies of a 4-page handbill he called the Chicago Defender. His initial investment was 25 cents. Abbott had come to Chicago after being unable to find legal work in the South because of his race, and he carried a fury about it that bled into every page. The Defender reported lynchings in detail that white papers wouldn't touch, used bold red headlines, and from the start carried a banner that read, "American race prejudice must be destroyed." It was sensational. It was fearless. And it was, very quickly, the most important black newspaper in the country. What made the Defender different from every other black publication was distribution. Abbott worked out an informal arrangement with Pullman porters, the black men who staffed the sleeping cars on the nation's railroads, to carry bundles of the paper south into Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana. In many southern towns, being caught reading the Defender could get you beaten, or worse, which only increased its mystique. Each copy was estimated to be read by 4 or 5 people. By 1916, circulation hit 50,000. By 1918, 125,000. By the early 1920s, more than 200,000, with 2/3 of those readers living outside Chicago. And Abbott knew exactly what he was doing with that audience. The Defender ran job listings for Chicago factories. It published train schedules. It ran photographs of well-dressed black families in front of brick apartment buildings, of black men in suits going to baseball games, of children in schools that had actual books. In August 1916, a Defender editorial declared that since the European War had shut down immigration and northern factories were desperate for labor, the moment had come. Abbott even set a date, May 15, 1917, for what he called the Great Northern Drive. Come north, come to Chicago. The promised land is real. And they came. The Illinois Central Railroad ran straight from the Mississippi Delta to Chicago's South Side, from Mobile and New Orleans, through Jackson and Memphis, up through the flatlands of downstate Illinois and into the city. Between 1916 and 1918, more than 100,000 black Southerners rode it north. Over the next half-century, the number would reach roughly 500,000. Most came from Mississippi, Tennessee, and Louisiana, drawn by the promise of factory work in meatpacking, steel, and manufacturing, and by the ease of that single railroad line threading from the cotton fields to the stockyards. They came with cardboard suitcases, and sometimes nothing at all, and they stepped off the train at 12th Street Station into a city that was, at least, not trying to kill them openly. The shock was immediate and double-edged. The jobs were real. The packing houses hired black workers, especially during strikes and labor shortages, and the war economy kept the factories humming. But the rents were astonishing. Landlords in the Black Belt charged more per square foot than comparable apartments in white neighborhoods because they could. A family that had paid $5 a month for a shotgun house in Mississippi might find itself paying $25 for 2 rooms on South State Street, with a shared bathroom down the hall and a landlord who hadn't painted the walls since the building went up. The housing was old, dense, and falling apart, and every month more people arrived to fill it. The question was always where they could live, and the answer was on a very narrow strip of the South Side, between roughly 22nd Street and 55th Street, never more than a few blocks wide, hemmed in on every side by neighborhoods full of white people who did not want them. The area had once been the estate of Senator Stephen Douglas. The official community name was still Douglas, but by 1910 it had acquired other names: the Black Belt, the Black Ghetto, and, briefly, something worse that isn't worth repeating. In the 1930s, a theater editor at the Chicago Bee named James Gentry proposed a different name. He said black American skin was closer to bronze than black, and the name should reflect that. The Chicago Defender popularized it. From then on, the neighborhood would be known as Bronzeville. Here is the paradox that makes this story unlike any other American neighborhood story. Segregation was vicious. It was enforced by restrictive covenants, by banks that refused loans, by real estate agents who steered white buyers away, and when all else failed, by bombs. Jesse Binga found that out personally. Binga had arrived in Chicago in 1892 as a street peddler, reportedly with $10 in his pocket. By 1908, he had opened the first black-owned bank in the city at 35th and State after the white-owned McCarthy Bank on that corner collapsed during the Panic of 1907. Binga saw the opportunity and seized the building. On opening day, deposits exceeded $200,000. Through the 1910s, Binga became the South Side's dominant real estate broker. He bought run-down buildings, renovated them, and rented to the thousands of black families pouring in from the South. His marriage to Eudora Johnson, A relative of John Mushmouth Johnson, the Black Belt's gambling kingpin, brought him a $200,000 inheritance when Johnson died. He acquired over 1,200 property leaseholds. He built a 5-story office building at 35th and State called the Binga Arcade, with a rooftop ballroom for $325,000. Within a few years, his bank held $1.3 million in deposits, worth roughly $37 million in today's money. W.E.B. Du Bois called him outspoken, self-assertive, a man who could not be bluffed or frightened. White Chicago's response was blunt. When Binga moved his family into a house at 5922 South Park Avenue, a white neighborhood, his home was bombed. Not once, 7 times over 2 years. Each time, offers would come in from people wanting to buy the house. Each time, Binga refused, rebuilt, and hired 24-hour security. His real estate office at 4724 State Street was bombed, too. Someone tossed an explosive out of a passing car on November 12, 1919. It blew out windows and sent title documents scattering into the street. That date matters. It was less than 4 months after the worst race riot in Chicago's history. On July 27, 1919, a 17-year-old black boy named Eugene Williams was swimming in Lake Michigan near 29th Street. He drifted past an invisible line that separated the white section of the beach from the black section. A white man named George Stauber threw rocks at him. Williams couldn't swim well. Most black Chicagoans had been kept out of pools, and he drowned. A police officer named Daniel Callahan refused to arrest Stauber and prevented both white and black swimmers from attempting a rescue. When word spread, rioting erupted. For 7 days, white mobs attacked black Chicagoans who fought back. When it was over, 38 people were dead, 23 of them black. 537 were injured, and about 1,000 were left homeless. But here is the paradox. Segregation, for all its cruelty, had an unintended economic consequence. It created a captive market. Every dollar a black person on the South Side spent on entertainment, groceries, insurance, banking, medical care, legal services, or a haircut went to a black-owned or black-serving business because there was nowhere else to go. The talent that in an open city might have dispersed across dozens of neighborhoods was compressed into a few dozen blocks. Doctors lived next door to day laborers. Jazz musicians played to audiences that included the city's only black congressman. The concentration was suffocating and simultaneously electrifying. Nowhere was this more visible than at the corner of 47th Street and South Parkway, the intersection that became, for 3 decades, the Times Square of black America. In 1927, a syndicate of developers broke ground on a massive commercial complex at that corner. The project cost $1.5 million and included 3 linked institutions: the South Center Department Store, which contained 250,000 square feet of commercial space; the Savoy Ballroom, which opened on Thanksgiving night 1927 and immediately became one of the finest dance halls in the country; and the Regal Theater, which opened on February 4, 1928. The Regal seated 3,000 people. It was designed in a lush Moorish style. The ceiling evoked the underside of an Arabian tent, with distant castles painted along the interior walls. The Chicago Defender described it as an Oriental garden on a moonlit night. It employed black staff in management, ushering, and front-of-house roles at a time when most Chicago theaters would only hire black people for janitorial work. Its house band was a 22-piece jazz orchestra. The opening act was Fess Williams and his Royal Flush Orchestra, a group that had built a following at the Savoy and now had a permanent home. Harlem's Apollo Theater, the venue most Americans associate with black entertainment, wouldn't open for another 6 years, and it held only half as many seats. In 1945, sociologists St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton published Black Metropolis, a landmark study of the South Side, and in it they described the corner of 47th and South Parkway as a place where you might find a black congressman dining next to the former heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, while in the private room, a delegation of civic leaders, black and white, planned reforms over steak. It was, they wrote, an entire world compressed into a few city blocks, a world with its own class structure, its own economy, its own newspapers, its own internal politics. The compression was suffocating and, simultaneously, the source of its power. The list of performers who played the Regal is essentially a catalog of 20th century American music. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie, Nat King Cole, Miles Davis, Muddy Waters, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Stevie Wonder, B.B. King, The Temptations, the Jackson Five. In 1964, B.B. King recorded what many consider the greatest live blues album ever made, Live at the Regal, on that stage. Chicagoans who were there remember the audience as much as the performer. The Regal crowd was famous for being the most responsive, most knowledgeable, most demanding audience in the country. If you could hold the Regal, you could hold anywhere. And 47th Street was only part of it. Further north along State Street, between 26th and 39th, was The Stroll, a stretch so dense with pedestrians day and night that walking it felt like wading through a current. Policy runners and preachers shared the sidewalk with doctors and domestic workers. The policy game, an illegal numbers lottery, was the South Side's shadow economy, generating millions of dollars a year in revenue, employing hundreds of runners and clerks, and funding everything from mortgages to church donations. The policy kings were celebrities on the stroll. John Mushmouth Johnson, whose estate would later enrich Jesse Binga's wife, ran the biggest operation in the Belt until his death in 1907. The Bronzeville policy wheel wasn't just gambling, it was a financial system for people whom the official financial system refused to serve, and its profits cycled back through the neighborhood in ways that legitimate banking never did. The Sunset Cafe at 35th and Calumet hosted young Louis Armstrong in the mid-1920s. He played there nightly, leading a band that invented a style of jazz so new that musicians came from across the country to sit in the back and take notes. Within a few years, recordings from those sets would essentially redefine the trumpet's role in American music. Earl Hines played piano at the Sunset, too, and the club's floor shows featured chorus girls and comedians in a setting that mixed sophistication with South Side grit. Down the street, the Dreamland Cafe and the Plantation Cafe drew their own crowds. On any given night in the late 1920s, 35th Street alone offered more live jazz per block than any street in the world, including anything in New York. Daniel Hale Williams had performed pioneering open-heart surgery at Provident Hospital nearby on the South Side. The Wabash Avenue YMCA would help establish what became Black History Month. Mahalia Jackson sang gospel in Bronzeville churches before the world knew her name. The institutions were not just cultural. Anthony Overton relocated his Overton Hygienic Manufacturing Company to South State Street and built it into the first African-American-owned major business conglomerate, cosmetics, banking, insurance, and newspaper publishing, all from one building. He was the first businessman of any race to receive the NAACP's Spingarn Medal. Robert Abbott, by now one of the first self-made black millionaires in America, lived in a mansion at 4742 South Parkway. Oscar Stanton DePriest, elected from the South Side in 1928, became the first black congressman since Reconstruction. The South Side wasn't just producing culture. It was producing political power, financial institutions, and a professional class, all within a corridor you could walk end to end in an afternoon. This was the peak, and like most peaks, the people living through it didn't know the ground was already shifting. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and Chicago, dependent on heavy industry, was among the hardest-hit cities in the country. For the Black Belt, the Depression was a specific and targeted catastrophe. The black-owned financial institutions, the ones that had been built painstakingly, brick by brick, inside the walls of segregation, were the most vulnerable. They were small, They were local. They didn't have the cushion of national branch networks or diversified portfolios. Jesse Binga's bank closed in 1930. Investigators found he had been using inadequately secured loans to speculate in real estate, the very activity that had built his fortune. He was convicted of embezzling $22,000 and sentenced to 10 years. Clarence Darrell, nearly retired, tried to get him paroled and failed. Binga served 3 years, came home broke, and spent the rest of his life working as a janitor and handyman at a Catholic church. He died in 1950 without enough money to put his name on the family headstone at Oakwood Cemetery. The Binga Arcade, that $325,000 monument to self-reliance at 35th and State, had been built, as one historian put it, in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the bank failed and the Depression gutted the surrounding businesses, the 35th Street commercial district collapsed. By 1950, a local writer dismissed the intersection of 35th and State as Bronzeville's Skid Row. The center of gravity shifted south to 47th Street, where the Regal and the Savoy still drew crowds, and where white-owned businesses with access to broader credit lines managed to survive. But the Depression was only the first blow. The second was quieter, and in the long run, far more destructive. After World War II, a second great wave of migration poured into the South Side. Between 1940 and 1960, Chicago's black population more than doubled. The Black Belt, already overcrowded, became a pressure cooker. Families doubled and tripled up in apartments designed for half as many people. Buildings that should have been condemned stayed open, because there was literally nowhere else for their occupants to go. And the people who controlled the housing supply knew it. Between 1950 and 1970, more than 60,000 black families in Chicago purchased homes. More than 75% of those purchases were made through something called a home sale contract. It worked like this. A white speculator would buy a house in a changing neighborhood for, say, $12,000. Days or weeks later, he would sell it to a black family for $22,000, an 84% markup. But the family didn't get a mortgage. They signed a contract. The speculator held the deed. The family made monthly payments at inflated interest rates, building no equity whatsoever. And if they missed a single payment, they were evicted, and the house went back to the speculator to be sold again to the next family. A Duke University study later calculated that this practice extracted between $3.2 billion and $4 billion in wealth from Chicago's black community in today's dollars. The very banks that refused to give black families conventional mortgages were behind the scenes funding the speculators who preyed on them. That number deserves a moment. $3 to $4 billion. Exposed wealth, stripped away in 2 decades from people who were already confined to the least desirable housing in the city. The effects compounded across generations. In Chicago today, 74% of white families own their homes. Among black families, the number is 39%. The roots of that gap run straight through the contract selling operations of the 1950s South Side. And then came the concrete. In the late 1950s, Chicago began construction on the South Route Expressway, later renamed the Dan Ryan after a recently deceased Cook County Board president. The project was made possible by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which put 90% of construction costs on the federal tab and turned urban expressways into irresistible civic investments. When the original route was planned, it would have crossed the Chicago River and run south, close to Low Avenue, the street where Mayor Richard J. Daley lived, in the white Irish neighborhood of Bridgeport. But the final plans shifted the route several blocks east to run along Wentworth Avenue instead. This was a less direct path. It required 2 sharp curves in a short distance. Engineers would have preferred the straighter line. But the detour had one advantage that, depending on whom you asked, was either a coincidence or the entire point. Wentworth Avenue was already the dividing line between black and white Chicago. The expressway, 14 lanes wide and 12 miles long, would turn that invisible line into a physical barrier that no pedestrian could cross. Daley's neighborhood was protected. The Black Belt was walled in. Construction displaced thousands of residents. The Urban League estimated 12,000 black residents would lose their homes. The actual number, when combined with other urban renewal projects on the south and west sides, exceeded 81,000. Despite making up only 23% of Chicago's population, black residents accounted for 64% of those displaced. The first segment opened December 12, 1961. By December 1962, the full expressway was complete. And then, as if to make the wall's purpose unmistakable, the city stacked 28 high-rise buildings along State Street on the east side of the expressway in a 2-mile line from 39th Street to 54th Street. This was the Robert Taylor Homes, completed in 1962 and named, in a cruelty that almost defies belief, after Robert Rochon Taylor, the first black chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority, who had resigned in protest in 1950 because the city insisted on concentrating public housing in black neighborhoods rather than integrating it across the city. Taylor died in 1957, 3 years before construction began on the project that bore his name. He would have been appalled. The numbers were enormous. 28 buildings, each 16 stories tall, containing 4,415 apartments, arranged mostly in U-shaped clusters of 3. Designed for 11,000 residents, the complex at its peak held 27,000. At one point, 6 of the poorest census tracts in the United States, with populations above 2,500, were located within the Robert Taylor Homes. Approximately 95% of residents were unemployed, including non-working age children. 96% were black. Roughly 40% of households were headed by single women earning less than $5,000 a year. The buildings themselves were designed to fail. The walls were made of cheap drywall that could be kicked through. Burglars routinely broke into apartments by punching through the wall from a vacant unit next door. The elevators were mounted on the exterior of the buildings, exposed to Chicago winters, and they froze regularly. In 1972, a reporter described being trapped in a malfunctioning elevator that went up and down from the 1st to the 16th floor for half an hour without opening its doors. The breezeway design, originally intended to encourage neighborly interaction, instead became a gauntlet. Women were attacked in stairwells and elevators. In a desperate and misguided attempt at security, the CHA surrounded the development with barbed wire in 1974 and conducted police sweeps that treated every resident as a suspect. 3 gangs divided the territory: the Mickey Cobras, the Gangster Disciples, and the Black Disciples. They competed for control of specific buildings, using them as distribution points for heroin and later crack cocaine. The Chicago Housing Authority estimated that $45,000 worth of drug transactions occurred daily within the development. During one weekend, a single weekend, more than 300 separate shooting incidents were reported in the vicinity of the Robert Taylor Homes. State Street, the same street where Jesse Binga had built his bank, where the Stroll had buzzed with life, where Robert Abbott had printed his newspaper, was now a 2-mile corridor of concrete towers where children grew up hearing gunfire the way suburban children heard lawnmowers. And around the Robert Taylor Homes, the rest of the South Side's economy was vanishing. The stockyards, which had been declining for decades as refrigerated trucks and rural packing plants made the centralized Chicago model obsolete, processed their last animal at midnight on July 30th, 1971. The peak year had been 1924, when more than 18.6 million head of cattle, hogs, and sheep passed through the yards. By the late 1960s, the number had fallen to a fraction of that. Armour and Swift had already closed their Chicago plants in the 1950s, relocating to Nebraska and Iowa, where they could slaughter animals closer to where they were raised. The National Wrecking Company cleared the 102-acre site and the 8-story exchange building in about 8 months. The only thing left standing was the neo-Gothic Union Stockyard Gate on Exchange Avenue, built in 1879. A stone arch leading to nothing, surrounded by an industrial park. 2 years after the yards closed, the Regal Theater was demolished. It had closed its doors in 1968, and despite community protests, the wrecking ball came in 1973. The Savoy Ballroom had already shut down in 1958. The South Center department store was gone. The entire $1.5 million commercial complex that had anchored 47th and South Parkway, the corner that had been the cultural capital of Black America, was erased. In the space of 4 years, the South Side lost both the industrial base that had drawn its first immigrants and the cultural institution that had defined its second community. Nothing of comparable scale replaced either one. The stockyards became a business park. The Regal site eventually became part of the Harold Washington Cultural Center, a modest facility that opened in 2004. A building that, whatever its merits, no one would cross a city to visit. What filled the vacuum was what always fills a vacuum when employment disappears and institutions collapse: an underground economy run by people with guns. The gangs that had operated on the South Side since the Irish first established territories in the 19th century evolved into something far more organized and far more lethal. The vice lords had briefly attempted legitimacy in the 1960s, running social programs funded by government grants. By the 1970s, that experiment was over, and the gangs returned to the drug trade with a sophistication that matched the legitimate businesses they had replaced. They had hierarchies, distribution networks, territories defined down to individual buildings, and enforcement mechanisms that made the old ward bosses look quaint. When crack cocaine arrived in the mid-1980s, it acted as an accelerant on a fire that was already burning. The profit margins were enormous. A kilo of cocaine could be cooked into crack and sold in small rocks for 10 times its wholesale cost. And the competition for territory became lethal on a scale the South Side had never seen. Young men who couldn't find a job at a factory that no longer existed could make hundreds of dollars a day standing on a corner. The incentives were rational, even if the outcomes were catastrophic. By the 1990s, certain South Side neighborhoods, Englewood, Auburn Gresham, Roseland, Grand Crossing, parts of Woodlawn, carried homicide rates that rivaled war zones. The reputation consumed everything. The South Side, which contained neighborhoods ranging from the affluent, Beverly, Hyde Park, to the solidly middle class, Bridgeport, Pullman, was painted in the national imagination as a monolithic landscape of violence. The data didn't support that generalization. Most crime was concentrated in specific community areas, not spread across the entire South Side. But nuance doesn't travel well. And the phrase, South Side of Chicago, became shorthand for American urban failure. In 1999, the Chicago Housing Authority launched the Plan for Transformation, the largest public housing overhaul in American history. The plan called for the demolition of nearly 18,000 units of high-rise public housing and the construction of mixed-income, lower-density developments in their place. The promise was that displaced residents would be given the right to return to the new communities. The Robert Taylor homes began coming down in the early 2000s. The last tower was demolished on March 8, 2007. The redevelopment, renamed Legends South, called for about 2,300 low-rise homes and apartments at an estimated cost of $583 million. The promise of return for many former residents turned out to be hollow. The new mixed-income developments had far fewer units than the towers they replaced. The entire Legends South plan called for 2,300 homes, roughly half the number of apartments that had existed in the Robert Taylor homes alone. Section 8 vouchers scattered families across the metropolitan area, often into neighborhoods on the far South Side or in south suburbs with their own concentrations of poverty. Some former residents found stable housing. Many did not. At least one study found that relocated families ended up in areas with poverty rates nearly as high as the ones they'd left. The sociologist Mary Patillo described the plan for transformation as the largest forced migration of black Chicagoans since the city had herded them into the Black Belt in the first place. The towers were gone, but the underlying conditions, joblessness, underfunded schools, the generational legacy of redlining and contract selling, the absence of banks and grocery stores and commercial infrastructure remained, just dispersed more widely across the map. Today, if you drive south on State Street from the Loop, you pass through a landscape that is almost hallucinatory in its contrasts. There is new construction in Bronzeville, condominiums and townhouses aimed at middle-income buyers, some of them drawn by the neighborhood's historical cachet. The Bronzeville Black Metropolis was designated a National Heritage Area, and heritage tours guide visitors to the 9 remaining architectural landmarks from the old community. A few blocks away, vacant lots outnumber occupied buildings. The Overton Hygienic Building still stands at 3619 South State, a designated landmark. The Chicago Defender moved from print to online only in 2019. The Binga Arcade is gone. The Regal Theater is gone. The Savoy Ballroom is gone. On Exchange Avenue, the Union Stockyard Gate still arches over the street, a limestone monument to an industry that employed 40,000 people and then vanished. It was designated a Chicago landmark in 1972 and a National Historic Landmark in 1981. It is the only physical remnant of the stockyards. Around it, the industrial park hums with the quiet business of warehouses and light manufacturing, useful, functional, and utterly forgettable. Where the Robert Taylor home stood, along that 2-mile stretch of State Street, the Legends South development offers 3-story row houses in muted colors. They are decent buildings. They are not overcrowded. They have working elevators. They are, by every measurable standard, better than what they replaced. They also house a fraction of the people the towers once held, and the blocks between the new developments are in places as empty as the prairie that Stephen Douglas once surveyed before the city swallowed his estate. The South Side story resists the clean ending because it isn't over, and because the forces that shaped it, the compression of a population into too small a space, the extraction of wealth through rigged financial instruments, the construction of infrastructure designed to divide rather than connect, the warehousing of poverty in buildings designed to be cheap rather than livable, are not historical curiosities. They are patterns. They recur. They show up wherever a city decides that some of its residents can be contained rather than included, and wherever the market discovers that containment is profitable. But that is analysis, and analysis isn't really the point. The point is a specific corner, 47th Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, the address that used to be 47th and South Parkway. On a Saturday night in 1940, this intersection was a river of sound and light, the Regal's marquee blazing with the name of whatever act was headlining that week, the Savoy's doors open to the cold, a 22-piece orchestra warming up inside, the sidewalks so packed that you moved with the crowd or you didn't move at all. Women in fur stoles and men in double-breasted suits, policy runners and Pullman porters, a former congressman having dinner alongside a stockyard worker's daughter. All of them compressed into a few blocks by a system that wouldn't let them live anywhere else. And all of them, on that Saturday night, making something so alive that people traveled 1,000 miles on the Illinois Central just to stand in the middle of it. The Regal is gone. The Savoy is gone. The South Center is gone. The marquee lights are gone. The 22-piece orchestra is gone. On that corner today, there is a mural on the northeast side of the intersection depicting the musicians who once played there. It is a nice mural. It is a picture of a thing that used to be real. A few miles north, the stone gate still stands on Exchange Avenue. It was built to last, and it has. It is a very fine gate. It leads to an industrial park where nobody goes unless they work there. The arch frames nothing but pavement and sky. At certain times of day, when the light is right and the trucks are quiet, it almost looks like it's waiting for something to come through.